and welcome to this special episode of What Will I Be When I Grow Up? Today, we're looking at International Women's Day with its theme of Give to Gain. So, the Give to Gain campaign encourages a mindset of generosity and collaboration, and it emphasizes the power of reciprocity and support. Which I personally feel is something that women have always been pretty good at. And it's sometimes an expectation placed on us that we need to give, not always with a lot of gain. And it's nice to kind of think about how we can move forward with that concept and how women can think about giving, not necessarily always of themselves, but also giving more broadly, but also thinking about how they deserve to be recognized for what they're giving, and not something that should just be expected because they're women. I'm very excited today to introduce our guest, Aisha. Aisha Hassan studied English language and literature at the University of Oxford and has a Master of Science in Journalism from Columbia University. She co-founded the Dia Guild with the hope to amplify Southeast Asian artisans and cultural voices. We'd also like to welcome Yasmin to the episode today. Yasmin studied law at the University of Essex, and she served as vice president of the International Students Union. Her journey has been quite interesting. She worked across government agencies, corporate organizations like PwC, but she, in the last couple of years, pivoted and started her own business where she spends time supporting students or job seekers who are looking for opportunities. She spends a lot of time reviewing CVs. And maybe just quickly a question for you, Yasmin. What patterns have you noticed in reviewing CVs, but what makes a candidate stand out?
First of all, thank you so much, Divina, for having me. So in regards to your question, I think that candidates with a very clear career narrative will stand out. Oftentimes, when it comes to CVs, people think that they need to share everything that they've ever done in their life, but that's really not the case, right? So a resume or a CV, because in Malaysia, we tend to use those terms interchangeably, really needs to tell a clear story of your interests and your career aims. So for instance, if anyone out there is a student and you're looking for an internship or for your first job, it's so important to highlight any relevant experiences that you've had. So if you are keen to, say, become an auditor, then it's so important to highlight your technical skills in Excel. And it's important to highlight, your interest in the field. So share further on any related webinars you've joined or any related courses you've taken up. Make sure that people can tell that you want to become an auditor by the end of your document. And make sure to personalize it as well. I always say that if somebody else were to read your CV without looking at your name and they can't tell that it's you, then you haven't done enough to stand out, right? Because all your peers will have a very similar CV as well.
One of the things I was told when I was was not to put my age on my CV because and this is an interesting question. It was the lady who advised me about this said that, sometimes if you put your age and you're a little bit too young, you may not be taken too seriously. Is that fair?
I think that's actually correct. I think, unfortunately, in Malaysia, there's some age bias, there's a lot of different biases at play. So what I always recommend is to remove these personal details from your resume. So anything in regards to your age, your gender, your religion, your home address, please remove it as well because that's private information. And I think that, what's most important is really your capabilities and your ability to do the job, right? So that should be demonstrated through your professional experiences or through your academic studies. So that should be the focus of your CV.
All the more reason people shouldn't give you their address when you're stopping them on Washington Square, Aisha. Aisha, welcome. It's really nice to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time this morning to be here to chat with me. Can I just ask you as a sort of first question? So your journey clearly spans academia, media, and philanthropy before you co-founded Dia Guild. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you were doing before Dia Guild? And then we can move on to your entrepreneurial leap.
Sure. So, firstly, thank you so much for having me as well. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak with you today. So, prior to starting DIA, my career has always historically been in journalism and writing. As you mentioned, I studied English at Oxford. And then, after a couple of years of working at Harper's Bazaar, the fashion magazine, after that, I then moved to New York to pursue my master's. And I actually continued in journalism, but I was writing about tech instead. So my whole career has kind of been about telling stories, although in pretty different fields. And concurrently, I was actually also teaching at that time. So at Harper's Bazaar, I was also doing some actually university and boarding school consulting. And I think I really enjoyed that. In that career of journalism, I met a lot of incredible people. I think I learned to be less shy about approaching people, about their stories, about telling those stories accurately. And I think that foundation of reporting was actually essential to us starting the business, as well as just that experience of speaking to people face to face, learning how to articulate yourself, learning how to express yourself to an audience. And those are all skills that I think really played an important role in us building the business later.
I am curious about the decision to sort of follow on from English literature to journalism. Did you feel that journalism was an obvious path after completing a degree in English literature?
To be completely transparent, I did not intend to end up in journalism. So after uni, I came back home, and my first internship, where I actually met one of my now co-founders, was at Kazana. So at a education event in the UK, I was poached by someone high up at Kazana at the time to go into their research investment arm. And my idea was actually always to go into consulting. So I was like, okay, Kazana, then I have my eye on like MBB, McKinsey, Bain, BCG. But in between that, I wanted to do a fun little internship at Harper's Bazaar because I wanted to fulfill this childhood dream of working in some glamorous magazine. And when I went for the interview and I applied, the editor in chief at the time said to me, I think you're kind of overqualified to be an intern. Why don't you just try a full time role? Probation is 6 months. If you really want to continue your consulting career or corporate career, then you can leave and that's fine. And then obviously within 6 months, I enjoyed myself so much. And then I had also started teaching in the evenings and on the weekends during that time. And I felt really quite fulfilled. And so I didn't feel this need to then continue jumping into the corporate world. And that's how I ended up staying in journalism, kind of by accident. And my friend Kylie, who is now my co-founder, who I met at Kazana, was going to business school at Wharton at the time. And, she kind of said you should think about some higher education options, maybe in the US. It was half for us to stay closer together, half to try and also fulfill another childhood dream of maybe moving to New York. And prior to Oxford, Columbia was actually my dream school, but my SAT scores were nowhere near good enough to apply. So then I thought, okay, let me give Columbia another shot. And then that's how I stayed in the path to journalism, a little by accident.
I was reading an article recently about how too many bright minds get lost into the corporate world,
Mm-hmm.
into jobs that, no beef with consulting per se,
Yeah.
or no beef with corporate jobs per se, but it kind of boxes you into being a very particular type of person. You get good at one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, you get paid a lot of money to be good at that one
Mm-hmm.
thing. So I love that I managed to draw this out of you because to
Yeah.
me that's super interesting that in choosing to pursue something that was a kind of childlike or lifelong
Yeah.
dream, it sort of led to this path. So tell us a bit about that time at kind of Columbia, and maybe a little bit about the differences of the way they teach and learn in the UK versus the US, because I think it's broadly quite different.
Yeah. So I think as many people might know when they're applying for undergrad, and I think I was going through that idea as well because I was deciding between an Ivy and then Oxford. I think the UK values or UK universities value like one very specific passion or skill, right? You go in applying for this one subject and your entire undergraduate career or higher education career there is going as deep as possible. Like, at Oxford, I really studied the entire span of English literature, and it was really academic prowess and performance that was valued above all else. And I really loved that, right? Because it was a subject that I loved and I could spend all day talking about it. When I got to the US, obviously I went there for a master's, so it was different to an undergraduate degree. But I did feel that breadth was valued more than it was in the UK. It's not just about knowing all you can about one thing. It's about everything that you do around that, which is not to say I didn't have extracurriculars in the UK or that, uni didn't encourage other interests, but it was less about intellectual discussion and definitely more about being on the ground, especially because my degree was in journalism. And the journalism degree in Columbia is known for being extremely hands-on. So for example, our first day in class, they brought us in for about 10 minutes and they just said, okay, you have to go onto the streets of New York and find 5 people at a subway station to tell you their story and also give you their full names, where they live, and their address, because you're reporting, right? And you can imagine it was sort of baptism by fire, being thrust into like Washington Square Station and trying to approach all these grumpy New Yorkers on their way to work and trying to stop someone to talk to me. And it was really a lesson in failure in the real world and how the real world really works versus me sitting in my Oxford College garden talking about Milton's Paradise Lost underneath the tree. And both were wonderful in their own right. But I think that my US experience really gave me sort of how it felt to be on the ground in the real world outside of the books. Yeah.
That's amazing. I'm not sure I would have the guts to wander around Washington Square asking people questions.
Yeah.
Or indeed asking them for their address. I think that would be the thing that would put most people off.
Yeah, it was. It was.
Yeah. I don't want to give you my address.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about then, I suppose after, kind of your time in New York, you came back to Malaysia. And is that when you co-founded Dia Guild?
Yes. So I moved back at the end of 2019, and Alia, Kylie, and I registered the company in July of 2020. It was meant to be a temporary move back. I thought I was coming back for a few months before moving back to the UK to settle long term, where I had planned to actually open a bookshop and a bar / boiler room. So it was going to be like a bookshop at the front, like a dance club at the back. And things were already in place for that. I mean, I had looked at venues, I was working on my visa, I had a business plan, but then the pandemic hit, which was obviously the worst time to open a bookshop / bar / club in London. And so that was the time when Alia, Kylie, and I got together to think about what business we wanted to start. Originally, we wanted to start a different type of business. Again, it was around events, similar to the types that we had been to in New York and London, where you choose a secret location and you throw a cool party with lots of retail and art. And then we kind of slowly iterated based on a lot of different factors and different research. And we eventually landed on what would become Dia.
It's interesting that you spent some time kind of living, and I guess part of your degree involved working as well. So what would you say are some key lessons from living and working abroad that have helped you with your work today, like that you've carried into your work today?
That's a great question. I think in New York especially was where I cultivated a much deeper sense of self-trust, whether as a woman or a man or whatever. I think before, in my experience of work culture in Malaysia, I worked around a lot of remarkable people who I saw as great mentors. But I think that sense of real self-security and owning your place and just asking for what you want and being confident and assertive about it actually was really cultivated overseas, which is not to say that it can't be cultivated here. I think that was just my experience because of my career there in, a city that really tests you in all the best ways. And I think that's something that I brought back. I feel extremely assured in who I am. And I think that translates to how you interact with people in a workplace, whether that's your clients, your employees, different vendors that you work with. And I think that sense of assuredness in your brand or how you want to conduct your work is actually pretty vital to building any work culture. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was one of the things that struck me because I worked in KL for a couple of years after I graduated. And then I went back to study and work in the UK for a number of years. And I just felt like the culture of feeling safe to speak up or to disagree with someone who is your manager was encouraged, but I also kind of felt that way about school. Like I felt like school here didn't necessarily encourage opportunities for me to speak up. Whereas when I went to university, there was much more space for that, like much more space to talk about, but I mean, people seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say about something, anything. Whereas I felt like growing up, it was a little bit harder. What about you, Yasmin, when you were studying at university, did you feel like that opportunity to speak up kind of came more regularly?
I do agree with you both. I think in the UK, they really value self-expression. And I actually read law in university, so even more so, right? You are encouraged always to have your own opinions. And it actually surprised me in the beginning because I think coming from, the Malaysian education system where you are encouraged to just memorize and regurgitate what you've learned, and respect your elders. And it's not to say that we don't respect our lecturers in the UK, but it's just a very different type of relationship. Even from day one, my lecturers told me to call them by their first name. And treated me like a peer, like an equal. And that really gave me that shot of confidence that I needed to be able to speak up. Because I think as a Southeast Asian woman, especially coming from quite a conservative family, I tend to be a little bit more soft-spoken. And in the legal field, it's not seen as a positive value. But in the UK, it really doesn't matter how softly you speak, as long as your voice doesn't shake, and as long as you have depth in your answers, they really respect you for it. So I had a fantastic time in university, and I really miss that aspect of living in the UK.
Do you feel you've been able to bring that into the work that you do, though? Like, I feel like that's one of the things that I feel very strongly about as the executive director of MABECS, that I want to encourage my colleagues to speak up. I want them to disagree with me if they think I'm doing something stupid or I'm suggesting a terrible idea. I don't want it to be that, oh, well, she's the boss, so we better not like say anything to her. Do you feel that you've been able to bring that into the work that you do today? I mean, this is actually a question for the both of you.
Do you want to start first, Aisha?
You go ahead, Yasmin. You start.
I think I definitely have managed to bring it over, at least for myself and in the people that I work with. So initially, I began my career in corporate communications. I was working at a government agency, and then I moved to working at the British High Commission. There, at the British High Commission, I think it's a lot easier for me to sort of be who I am, really, the person that I was since I came back from the UK. And afterwards, I actually joined PwC for a while before starting my own services. So I've pretty much been everywhere, really, in the past 8 years or so. But nowadays, I think I try my best in what I do to really redefine what strength is, right? So I work a lot with young people, young professionals, women returning back to the workplace. And I think more than anything else is that they've lost their confidence because the job market is so saturated and they've had such negative experiences. So, they kind of shrink in within themselves. So I really try my best to teach them how to actually come into their own and really regain that confidence. And in that sense, when I was in the UK, I sort of gained that sense of strength within myself to tell myself, oh, okay, actually, as a woman, as a younger person, my values are important. My principles are, recognized and respected. So I'm glad to have had that experience. And now I try my best to sort of cultivate that for others as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think similar to Yasmin. I have two co-founders, Alia and Kylie, who happen to be my best friends as well, but we've all had similar educational backgrounds. We went to school here and then the UK and then the US, and then we came back. And so I think we have a similar view to what Yasmin just shared. And I actually love what you said earlier about how softness is not necessarily something to be looked down on, but it's actually when you speak with clarity and depth that actually that counts for everything. And I think we try to bring that to our work culture. When we first started, we actually said we'd all prefer to over communicate rather than anything else. And not to say that that's something strictly restricted to women, but I think women are very good at communicating. And obviously, in a dynamic where you have three good female friends, just saying how they feel and standing firm on how they feel and our particular principles and the way we like to work. We've always brought that to our company, and we've always brought that into everyone that we work with as well. I think being transparent and feeling extremely confident in why you're transparent and what you're saying has really been the backbone of everything that we've done. And I'm glad that we still maintain that to this day.
Yes, over communicate and under promise. These are key principles,
Yeah.
which I actually think women are very good at. It is one of our strengths, and it's not often valued as openly in the corporate world. So it's nice to hear that you're kind of taking these things and these qualities and kind of implementing them in the work that you do. I just want to talk a little bit about, kind of storytelling, right? Because you both have mentioned storytelling as part of your sort of like journeys. And I guess with Yasmin, the work that you do with checking people's CVs and giving them advice on careers. And then I guess with you, Aisha, and your journalism and your literature, how do each of you use writing to give something back to others? And what have you gained in return from that?
Yasmin?
I think that's a really interesting question. Personally, for me, I do write a lot, and it is a big part of the work that I do as well. I think in writing, you're actually able to explore yourself, and not only that, you're able to create that narrative that's so important when it comes to presenting yourself well during interviews. I think everyone has a story, but not everyone actually manages to share their story in a way that's not necessarily interesting, that's not the right word, in a way that is appealing for others, perhaps, because especially in the job market, I mean, they can be quite tenacious with how they expect you to perform, right? And that's what interviews are, is a performance. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a scary thing. You just need to familiarize yourself with the process of, what's expected and what are they going to ask and things like that. So in regards to writing, I think it's crucial for somebody to really spend the time in getting to know themselves and expressing themselves through the art of writing and through speaking to others. And that's really how you're able to gain back that confidence, because once you start writing, especially about, like your life story, the lessons that you've gone through, you'll start realizing that you are resilient. You have gone through so many things, you have come out the other end. And I think not a lot of people give themselves the credit for it. And it's because they haven't had that reflection period of their lives. And it's something that I think people should do almost on a yearly basis, because there's so much growth, but you just don't learn to recognize that because you're so busy in, the humdrum of the day-to-day.
Yeah, and to that point, I think that exercise of self-reflection is so crucial. And I know there has been like this recent, or, in the last 10 years, everyone is bringing back up like journaling, diary writing, like letter writing. But I really think there's a reason why these things have stood the test of time immemorial, and people should incorporate them. But circling back to your question, Davina, I think in a professional capacity, writing is a core part of my work at DIA, because I lead kind of all marketing and branding. And when we started the company, one of our propositions, like value propositions for Southeast Asian brands that we would work with, was that we would help to tell your story, right? Because sometimes there were barriers such as language barriers, not the right market fit, because our market is international as well as local and regional. And by telling these stories of the people who are creating these items, the beautiful objects that create the cultures that they come from, it feels incredible to shine a spotlight on aspects of what is essentially a retail product that I think often goes unnoticed because, yes, it's a beautiful bag, but did you know that this uncle from this village dove into this ocean to get that piece of shell and this is his story? Like, I think that's something that I really love about the job. And it's also a very different type of storytelling that I've done before when I work on fiction or otherwise. So, in that sense, it's quite challenging to me in the same way that it also is rewarding to the makers themselves. And I think in a personal capacity, my founders have always been very generous in that alongside our main work, we're all allowed to pursue, quote unquote, side hustles. But for me, I've always had a pretty rich creative life alongside Dia. So even alongside building the business, I was, writing and acting in theater shows or writing and producing short films or short fiction or longer pieces of prose. And I think that has really fed me deeply and gratefully and to a degree that has helped to maintain my drive in a more professional setting as well. So in that way, writing and writing as art has always been very, very important to me.
That's wonderful. I obviously at the start when I kind of introduce this particular episode, I mentioned that we're kind of looking at the theme of International Women's Day for 2026, which is give to gain. What does that mean to each of you personally? Have you had a chance to think about what giving to gain looks like, or feels like for you? Yasmin?
Sure. I think it's a great theme, by the way. And for me, give to gain means actively sharing what I know so that someone else doesn't really have to share the struggle alone. So when I share job opportunities, review CVs, or explain how hiring managers actually think, I'm intentionally making information more accessible. And what I've gained from that really is trust and long-term relationships. And I've received a lot of messages from my clients or from people who secured roles because they truly understood themselves. And that's really important. And I've seen individuals really move from self-doubt to clarity simply because someone took the time to guide them. And it's so important to have as well in your support system. And most people don't have this. So for me, watching people regain that confidence and stability through meaningful work is really what I gain from the work that I do.
That's amazing, by the way. I just want to say, I think your point about just sharing opportunities is something that we really resonate with because similarly, when I think about give to gain, I think for us at Dia, it's really about being generous with your connections, right? Our whole business is built on creating an ecosystem of regional designers and artists and then giving them different platforms, whether that's through an offline space, a physical store, or we do a lot of work with hospitality. And I think to be open and generous with those connections in a world where maybe some people want to hold on tight to what they have is really important because at the end of the day, it's not about getting a bigger slice of the pie. It's about making the pie bigger for everyone. And by doing that, you and yourself and the people you work with will benefit from being part of a larger community. So for me, I think I really thinking about it in terms of connecting more people with each other and finding more platforms for everyone to do what they love and also be compensated fairly or recognized fairly for it.
So, interesting question, right? Do you think this idea of reciprocity, because at the start I sort of mentioned that I think there's an expectation on us to give in and of ourselves. There's an expectation of us not to be necessarily rewarded for what we give. And I think this is kind of, it's a changing landscape, but I still think there are so many parts of a woman's life where she's expected to do certain things because she's a woman, right? And so do you think when women start taking on positions of responsibility or leadership roles, or indeed, start up businesses or initiatives that are women, so that are led by women, right? Do you think reciprocity plays a bigger role in women-led initiatives compared to, say, traditional industries? Because Aisha, both of you talked about working in the corporate world before shifting or pivoting and doing something different. Do you think women are better at this reciprocity business?
I'm not sure what Yasmin's thoughts on this are, but for me, I think I have been quite lucky in that actually for most of my career, including academic, and I mean including my entire time at Oxford, I was only taught by either women or gay women. Like I've never been taught by a single man actually, which is actually quite rare. And then that followed on in university, and I've only ever worked, I worked in fashion. There was a lot of women. So I don't know if I'm best equipped to say whether women are more reciprocal. Obviously, outside of the workplace, I think that does tend to be true. But I don't think of it in terms of reciprocity, as in like I would return what is given. I think I've always just thought about it in terms of kind of like solidarity. Like everyone is really just trying to do the best they can. Like everyone in the workplace and their professional life is really just trying to get by and do the best they can with what they have. And to always act in the spirit of knowing that and trying to help each other with that. I do find that everyone I've worked with, which happens to be mainly women, is always very good at. And I think that's kind of just linked to compassion, right? Which then feeds into how you respond to and help and champion other people. So that's my experience.
I'm glad that you've had such a positive experience. And I do agree with you. I think in women-led spaces, there's that sense of solidarity and compassion and wanting to, sort of ensure that everyone has a seat at the table. But unfortunately, in some environments that I've been part of, especially in government agencies, I think that there is still that sort of traditional way of giving and receiving, but it's often limited to, unfortunately, men. It's quite traditional in that sense because people still give and receive. I mean, there's still mentorships, referrals, insider knowledge, but it happens almost like quietly, and it happens in certain spaces, especially when they socialize. And that kind of limits women because we know women aren't really able to participate in all these after work activities on the weekends. It's very much a boys' club. So since then, I've kind of been really intentional in the environments that I've chosen to be a part of. And I joined a lot of women-led spaces. And I think we're just more explicit about saying it out loud. Like we recognize that there's an issue and we talk about, equality, and we talk about how, confidence is still a big issue here in Malaysia. So when you're actually explicitly talking about the problem, then it's a lot easier to find solutions. And I don't necessarily think it's because women are more generous or more empathetic, but it's just because we are generally, we have experienced that exclusion, and so we're a lot more aware on how we want to shape other people's experiences. And men, because they don't often experience it in the same way, don't have that same level of consciousness. So yeah, I've had good experiences, bad experiences, but I'm very glad now that I'm able to be part of, primarily good experiences.
It's actually super interesting because my whole career has been mainly in education. And education is often very female dominated at the entry and middle management levels. Once you get to senior management, it's almost exclusively men. And it's fascinating to see where that ceiling starts, right? And then what that then means for the ecosystem and what that means for how women can choose to support each other or feel the need to be. I'm obviously a little bit older than the both of you, but that generational gap to me is super interesting because I think the conversations that you're having at your age now didn't exist when I was your age. So if you wanted to be, as I've always been pretty ambitious, if you wanted to kind of move up the ladder, you sort of felt like you had to be, you had to take on these attributes that are predominantly male, or exactly the point that you made, Yasmin, about not being part of the boys' club, right? So if you're not out with the lads having a few beers, or in this country, playing golf or whatever it is, men enjoy doing in their spare time, it just, you get excluded. So I love what you said about intentionally creating spaces where these things can be said out loud so that we can find solutions together. So I love this. I'm excited for the future because sometimes I think you can just be a bit down on like how things are. And then for me, I love doing this podcast because I get to hear lots of different voices. And then I'm like, oh, ada harapan juga akhirnya, which is great. Future is bright. So when you talk about women in leadership, right? What do you think one of the main misconceptions is about women in leadership?
I actually want to tie it back to something that Yasmin said earlier on in the podcast, which is actually something I thought about when I first saw this question is, and it ties on to what you just said as well. I think maybe a generation ago, there was this narrative that to really make it to the top, to make it to the C-suite, you had to be like a hard woman. Like you had to really be just as ruthless as the guys, like, you know, talk in that kind of way. And I actually think that's a massive misconception. Obviously, I know that that is the lived reality of a lot of corporate spaces. I'm not trying to invalidate that that is a narrative that was based on definitely a basis of truth. But I actually feel like retaining some of that softness and consciousness is really a superpower because you can be strong with your boundaries. You can be assertive without having to have this fear mongering or very intense way of going about it, right? I think about some women I know in some of the highest positions of huge organizations throughout this country, and they're some of the, you know, sweetest, most compassionate people in the workplace, but they still get the job done and they get it done better than everyone else. So I think that one does not have to sacrifice one sense of softness or vulnerability in the workspace to get to where you want to be, even if that means like the very, very top. Because I actually think it's refreshing to bring that to the table in a place where the table has not always welcomed that sort of perspective before. So I think that's my take on it.
I completely agree with you, Aisha. I think there's that misconception that, you know, you have to be aggressive in order to be a good leader, or you have to have authority or have a strong presence, but it really doesn't have to be that way. And I think in Malaysia in particular, where it's a little bit more collaborative, a little bit more inclusive, I think finding your own leadership style is so important. And there's also another assumption that I like to talk about. So there's also this assumption that once you have family responsibilities, it really limits your progress, right? And limits your ability to commit to your job. And I just want to highlight that the issue isn't capability, but it's really structural support. Because right now, unfortunately, we might have in place certain policies, or, you know, a lot of these corporations talk about flexibility and workplace culture, but in practice, that's not the case. It's often there just to present a very modern, progressive workplace, but in reality, there's a lot of expectations placed on women in middle management, and that's why they're not able to actually ascend to C-suite. And a lot of people will say that it's because there's not enough qualified women, but in reality, I mean, if you look at it from every single level, Malaysia has very high participation in tertiary education. So I really don't think that the challenge is in talent, but it's really about, again, what we've been talking about, access to certain spaces like networks and mentorship and decision-making spaces. So unfortunately, in the I would say in the past decade or so, there's seemingly a lot of progress done, but in reality, it might not be the case. And that's what personally I try to challenge in the workplaces that I've been in, because, you know, you cannot just share that you cannot just talk the talk. You really have to walk the walk. So yeah.
I think that's absolutely spot on. It's the structural issues that remain in businesses, right? So it was one of the things that when COVID happened, it's interesting, Aisha, because we expanded the business just before COVID, and you were talking about setting up the company just before COVID. And then we ended up having to work from home, right? So it's super interesting how we've not changed that dramatically, and work still goes on. We're still productive, right? So especially for colleagues who have kids, I think it's lovely that they still get to work from home 2 days a week. So at least 2 days a week, the school run isn't a total stress for especially the moms. But yeah, it is about creating those spaces within the organization. And I feel so strongly about this because you can do it, and you can do it well, and your business can still thrive. But it's about getting over those misconceptions that somehow your business is going to fail if not everybody's sitting there from 9 to 5. It's really also about trusting your team to get the job done. So I have a couple more questions. If you look back at your career so far, like what have been some of the toughest moments you faced as a woman in your job? And what helped you push through?
I am going to speak very candidly here because this is something that actually my co-founders and I, Ali and Kylie, we've been asked in the past with, press interviews. And I honestly, all three of us have never particularly felt discriminated or disadvantaged in the workplace because we are women. Like we just have not had that experience, and that might be an exception to the rule, but that is our lived experience that I think we've been really lucky to have. Actually, if anything, we have found being three petite girls kind of to our advantage, because in the early parts of starting a business, I actually think a lot of people underestimated us when we came to a pitch or we came to get a client, before we lay our credentials on the table, which are, I would say actually fairly impressive amongst the three of us. People would really underestimate these three super friendly, small Malaysian girls. But that led us, as you said, to underpromise, but then also really over-deliver. So I have always kind of found it a bit of a superpower. And maybe it's also because in our industry, the majority of the people that we work with do happen to be women as well. Like we mainly work with female founders and female artisans. And so it's always been this shared experience rather than having a tough experience. And I've never had anything happen to me as a woman that I felt has really inhibited my professional life or made me struggle to move forward. But that is just mine and our experience. Yasmin, I'd love to hear about what yours has been.
I'm very happy to share that I can't think of a recent example. So I think, like I mentioned just now, I intentionally chose, women-led spaces and environments where I think I can thrive. But I'm happy to share one experience that I had early on in my career. So when I first returned home to Malaysia, I was working at a government agency, and I was often the youngest person in the room. And I was also one of the very few women in the room. And I was in a corporate communications role under the CEO, so I was working directly with him and his team. But there were several times where I was really excluded from the discussion, and many, many times where they thought I was just, a personal assistant or somebody there to set up the room, like provide teas. That happened a few times. And when I was younger, I didn't realize that that shouldn't be the way, right? I was just thinking, oh, okay, it's because I'm young. But over time, I started realizing that, as I entered more and more rooms, I was still the only woman in these rooms. So I think there's that sort of bias and that sort of, in some manners, even discrimination, because as I mentioned, there were a lot of times I was shut from these rooms because they didn't feel like I deserved to be there. So I think that taught me that as a woman, oftentimes your male counterparts will assume you're incompetent just because of your age or just because of your gender. And instead of reacting emotionally, I really tried to take it in stride. I had to prepare harder than everybody else. I had to prove myself almost. And that's the reality in some corporate spaces in Malaysia. Hopefully not now, because it has been a while. I'm not that young anymore, unfortunately. But yeah, I think that's taught me a lot about how I treat others now that I'm in those spaces, and about accessibility. So making sure that, in all the engagements that I do, that I include voices from youth, voices from people in marginalized communities, because they have so much more, they have very diverse experiences. And if we don't actually include their voices in the room, then we'll never realize that there are problems to begin with, right? So that's, like I mentioned, been an early career experience of mine. And as I speak to a lot of my clients now, they also struggle with it in different ways. So that's how, I sort of got into this space, because I realized that everything that I experienced, others struggle with in very similar ways. So since I've had that experience and I was able to overcome it, it's a lot easier for me to now guide them.
Yeah, it's interesting the number of times people thought I was the PA. And there's nothing wrong with being a PA. It's a great job. I wouldn't survive without mine. But yeah, I think the assumption that you that word emotional really bothers me too, because somehow anger has been excluded from the emotional space. And men get angry a lot, turns out. Okay, so, and one of the questions, it's interesting, this one, I don't know how I feel about this, but what do you think being a girl's girl means to you?
Yeah, when I saw this question on the briefing document, I was like, "Ooh, okay." I don't know if I've ever. I don't know about YouTube. I've never thought of myself as more a girl's girl than anything else. I think I just really love my female friends, but that is the entirety of the experience I've ever known. Like, I've never known anything else except that my female friends have happened to provide some of the most long-lasting, purpose-driven, growth-enhancing bonds in my life. And I don't think that is something that is limited to just female friendships. I think that's just my experience. I grew up with 3 older brothers who I'm extremely close to, so maybe that already filled my quota of like deep male bond prior to my husband, I guess. But yeah, when I think of the term girl's girl, I just think, aren't most people kind of girls if you love your female friends? I know that there are some people who people say aren't, but yeah, I've just never thought of myself and my friends as anything. But what about you, Yasmin?
No, I do agree with you. I actually studied in an all-girls school. So I have, well, I have 3 sisters, but I also gained another 3 through marriage. So there's a lot of strong women in my life. And I think being a girl's girl really is just about being genuine, and being confident in your femininity as well. Especially when, you're entering the working world, you tend to feel like you have to be a bit more masculine. You can't really be feminine or soft. But again, those are strengths, right? So in being a girl's girl, I think really it's about sharing access and opportunities and not gatekeeping anything that comes your way. As Aisha mentioned earlier, sometimes people tend to want to keep certain opportunities for themselves. And I think there's also a misconception that women tend to have to see each other as rivals in certain spaces. So I think being a girl's girl is completely about supporting other women and celebrating our progress, not just our achievements, because women have a harder time recognizing their progress. And I think collectively, there's so much we could do for each other. There's so much we could do in our own ways. You never really have to look too far in order to help somebody else, because in being active in a lot of spaces, people often ask me, oh, how do you actually get started, right? In being in these women organizations. But really, you don't have to make it harder than it is. You can always volunteer, you can always join events. And from there, these natural conversations tend to happen. And that's what being a girl's girl means to me, right? Just natural everyday engagements. It doesn't have to be something big. And down the road, it amplifies naturally. So yeah, I really enjoy the term girl's girl. I think on surface level, but I think as Aisha mentioned, at the end of the day, everyone is a girl's girl.
Yeah, and I would just like to add one more thing to that you just brought to mind. I think there is this distinct joy when you can just revel in being a girl. So it's not necessarily a girl's girl, but you can just bond over like, oh, I do love that dress. That is a great lip color on you. And that's not like a trivial matter. I think in literature, especially, there was a whole period of literature where women's interest in style and fashion and makeup was seen as frivolity. But actually, I think it's wonderful to take joy in these things and to take joy in whimsy and individuality. And I think girls can really hype each other up. And in the workplace, it's not like a detraction from when you're actually getting done. It's just creating a nice culture where you can acknowledge all different parts of yourself, from things that are extremely lighthearted to things that are heavy and serious. So I think that's an aspect that I really enjoy, especially in my work, being surrounded by great girls.
We definitely like to talk about fits at MABECS.
Mm-hmm.
All of us really do quite like our fashion,
Mm-hmm.
which is very nice. Okay, so I just have, I guess, one or two more questions. If you could encourage women to give one thing today to gain tomorrow, what would that be?
I would say, I think you should give more time to yourself. Because recently, and especially in the last year, and I've definitely said a lot about being generous with your time, and I think that's true, but I think sometimes we give a lot of our time because we want to be so helpful and we forget about giving just a bit more to ourselves and by saying no. And that recharging is really so valuable for you to be the best person you can be for yourself and your community later on. So I think I would say, don't shy away from giving yourself a bit of space, a bit of time, and taking that just for yourself. Because in the long run, that will actually feed the people that you want to help a lot more.
Just want to quickly say 2025, my word of the year was no.
Yeah, exactly. Saying no, keeping your boundaries. Like for me, like leaving people pleasing back in the last year, and I think
goodbye.
Yeah, and that's something I've really had to work on. And it's about giving back to myself rather than always thinking about how am I going to give to someone else. I think that's it for me.
Yeah, no, I love that. Yasmin?
I love that too. Actually, I heard someone say that no is a full sentence, and it really changed my life because before this, I had to justify, I had to make myself feel better. But no, it's a full sentence. You don't have to actually expand further if you don't want to. So for me, I think I would encourage women to really take the time as well, but to actually reflect on themselves and their progress. So as I mentioned, I think women have a hard time in actually recognizing the value that they bring others. So I would love it for women to actually sit down and document their progress, their achievements, the milestones they've reached. And I think this is so important because a lot of women also struggle with imposter syndrome in the workplace. But when you actually write all these things down, this documentation really becomes your evidence, right? And if you read it every day, it becomes an affirmation as well. It actually reminds you that you have so much value to give. And just because you haven't gone where you wanted to go doesn't mean that you're not at least halfway there. So that is actually what helps to build that confidence to succeed in the workplace. So I think that's something that I personally have done for the past few years, and it really has changed my trajectory as well. So this is a tried and tested method. So highly recommend it for people out there.
I think that's such a legitimate point. It's also definitely something that I struggle with. Kind of looking back at a year and kind of going, what did I do? Like, what did I achieve? And I think it's also for me, and you can kind of add to this if you like, it's about reframing what success is. Because I think often success is framed in terms of wealth accumulation, in terms of, I don't know, I mean, getting married or having children or whatever it is, right? And I've had to stop and like retract and just kind of go, okay, do I want all these things? Am I interested in wealth accumulation? And it's been super interesting to stop and ask myself those questions and kind of go, oh, you know what? Actually, I'm not that interested in that. Actually, I'm interested in all these other things that are more meaningful to me. So I sometimes like try and spout that to my nieces and nephews and kind of go, do what makes you happy. And I think this thing about resilience is the last question. How do you build, what about how do we go about building careers that are resilient and impactful? Is there one piece of advice that you have for so for people who are thinking about that?
Building on what you just said, Davina, about reflecting on what you actually want. I heard something recently, I don't recall where, but it was that the world is full of too many people who have too much, who don't think that they have enough, right? And I think to your point about using wealth accumulation as an example, look, that's a perfectly legitimate way. If you're trying to climb the social ladder, if you're trying to build a different life than what you or your parents had, what you had, then go after that, then do what you need to get there. But I think what people don't often talk about, and I think this is especially relevant to people who can afford to go to university overseas if you're not bonded, is that, take stock of your privilege and how you want to use that and what you want in the life that you want to build. Because I think people don't often consider their own circumstances enough when they have like a bit more than most into the life that they want to build. Because maybe you do have the luxury of pursuing something for fulfillment rather than, a high monthly salary in the beginning, which is not to say that you shouldn't go after economic stability in the long run, but don't limit yourself to pursuing, the internalized capitalist path of more is more is more, when actually you might have the luxury that a lot of people don't, which is to pursue something that gives you back something more than just a paycheck. So I think that's one thing, like actually take stock of your actual circumstances and don't be ashamed of maybe, making the most of it, because really most people can't. Like that's one thing. And on the note of resilience, I think something that has taken me a long time to learn and I'm still learning, and I don't know about you guys, is just not to conflate the professional with the personal. I think when you're invested in your job or when you're starting your own company and you're running your own business, it is so easy to equate professional performance to personal value. And learning to separate the two will really just let you get on with it. I spent so many weeks and months in the early years of starting this company looking at whatever shortcoming was happening in the company as a failure on a personal level, but that is just not the case. And I think learning to separate that will just let you get on with what really matters.
I think that's beautifully said, Aisha. And I really agree with Davina as well. I think in building that, that resilience, it's so important to actually understand yourself first, have that sense of self, have that sense of agency. And I actually attribute that to my studies in the UK, because I have a feeling that in the UK, people tend to be more confident in pursuing their own passions. Whereas in Malaysia, there's a lot of societal expectations and familial burdens as well. So as you mentioned just now, being privileged in a sense of being able to sort of see it out there and cultivate it for myself. But yeah, I think in building resilience, it's so important to have your own definitions of what's valuable to you. And having that sort of agency to take calculated risks as well. Sometimes people tend to not be resilient because they haven't actually had that privilege of failing. And I talk about this a lot with my clients and with others. A lot of people tend to shy away from failure because they think that it's something negative and people will judge them, so on and so forth. But in reality, when you fail, you learn so much about yourselves, more than actually succeeding in many ways, right? So I think it's so important to be familiar with the concept of failing and not shying away from it. And you'll realize that it's always the process, it's always the progress, not just the achievements that matter. If it was so easy, all the Nepo babies would be successful, but they aren't. So yeah, I think that's something that I try my best to remind others, not to be too shy, when they're pursuing their passions.
Although I gotta say, from time to time, I have moments where I wish I was a Nepo baby.
Of course, we all do.
Thank you so much, both of you, really. It's been, like I said, every time I do this podcast, every time I speak to people, I'm always encouraged and I'm always excited for the future, just because it's such an opportunity to hear from a range of voices, talking on a range of subjects. And I've always been a bit, to be honest, I don't know if I should say this out loud, but whatever, I'm used to saying silly things out loud. All my colleagues are used to hearing me saying silly things out loud. I've always felt a bit meh about International Women's Day, because sometimes to me it can feel a little bit performative, and it can feel a little bit like, I don't know. So when this topic of give to gain came up, my main like beef with it was give so much already, must give some more. I'm tired lah. I'm tired. I don't want to give. I want to gain. And also it's Chinese New Year, y'all. It's about gaining. But I don't know. In talking to you both, I feel like encouraged at the possibility of maybe stopping and understanding that value proposition of, okay, if I give, I can gain. It's not that I didn't know it. It's just this idea of sometimes, here we go again, another topic where women are supposed to give. But yeah, okay, we can also gain. It'll be good. So thank you very much. Any last thoughts from either one of you?
No, I would just like to say thank you. Thank you for having us. And it's been so nice to be in conversation with Yasmin as well. I think it's nice. It's been a long time since I've reflected on my higher education career, actually. And it's kind of lovely to think back because, for anyone listening to this who is either like a parent or a student, on that path, it's a really special time when you really actually have everything to gain. Because if you have the chance to go and pursue a tertiary education, which, most people don't, like I'm actually the first woman in my family from both sides to ever go to university, like it's actually a really big deal. And I would just say be audacious and just take all the big swings. Like I think that's the energy that I would like to leave for this podcast.
Same here. I think Aisha articulated it so well. I think you really have to just go for it. Because a lot of times people feel like, oh, they cannot apply for these scholarships because they're not good enough. But I think the UK approaches education in a very different way. I mean, you don't necessarily have to have straight A's to apply to these scholarships, especially for postgraduate opportunities where they really look at it holistically. And they really value your lived experience. And I admire that so much about how the UK approaches education as a whole. So yeah, be audacious, as Aisha said. You definitely won't regret it. And I wish you all the best in your journey. So thank you again, Davina and MABECS, for having us. It's been a lovely day. I think I unfortunately had a late start to the day. But yeah, I just wanted to wish you both, a long weekend if you're taking leave, and a happy Ramadan as well.
Audacity is the word we're leaving this podcast with. But also, Yasmin, you did my plug for me without even thinking about it. We do have 5 full scholarships for postgraduate study in the UK. I say full, it covers tuition. You got to figure out where to get your living costs from. So it's true. And every year, I know this is going to sound crazy, every year we struggle to get enough applicants for the scholarships because I think many people don't want to take the big swing. They're like, no la, I don't think I can get it. No, give it a go. So we have 2 full scholarships for the University of Birmingham, 2 full scholarships for St. Andrews University, and 1 scholarship for Warwick University for PGT to cover your tuition fees for 1 year. So you think of this, and all the women out there listening to this, think of this as your call to apply. So thank you very much, both. Lovely to have you here. Bye.